Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Right on Buddhism's Asian Religion series. In this series, we will be discussing religious traditions in Asia other than Buddhism. Buddhism has never existed in a vacuum, and as it has spread all across East Asia, it has developed, localized, and syncretized with local traditions in fascinating and significant ways. As such, we cannot provide a complete picture of East Asian Buddhism without discussing those local traditions, such as they were and such as they are. Today, we will be discussing Daoism, a very historically and culturally significant tradition originating in China. We hope you enjoy. Daoism is a scholarly term that we broadly use to refer to texts, rituals, and ideologies that have circulated in China throughout history regarding this thing called the Tao. The word Tao is a Chinese word translating to way, or path, or pursuit. And in the context of Daoism, it refers to this ineffable pattern, process, and means of the unfolding of reality and the universe. We will keep coming back to this idea of the Tao because Daoist and Confucian thinkers reimagine and redefine this term over and over and over again in their texts and treatises. There are several critically important texts in which this Tao and how we ought to understand and relate with it are discussed, including the Daodejing, the Zhuangzi, the Mo-tzu, and more. For the purposes of this episode, we will speak mostly about the Daodejing, but we will also refer to the other texts mentioned. The Daodejing originates as far back as at least the 4th century BCE, but no official date of authorship is widely agreed upon. Similarly, no singular author is agreed upon. The name of the proclaimed author is Lao-tzu, but that simply translates to the title Old Master, and so it could refer to anybody or a group of individuals. Indeed, it is widely agreed upon that the Daodejing is not a monograph authored by one author about one topic, but rather a compilation of passages authored by many people over the course of history, each concerning some perceived facet or aspect of the Tao. On the other hand, the Zhuangzi and the Mo-tzu, which both came after the Daodejing, were authored by historical individuals, and they are in their own way responses to the Daodejing. In part 1 of our discussion of Daoism, we will discuss the contents of the Daodejing and the basic tenets and philosophy of ancient Daoism, and also the political ideology that forms through Daoism. Daoism and Confucianism both arose in China in ancient times in an ecosystem of Chinese folk religion, which is highly diverse and complicated. We have talked about how much of it understood the natural world to be populated with spirits, and how these spirits had to be placated ritually in order to ensure that they would protect and preserve the community of the living. That is about all we can say about the common thread among many of these religions. Aside from that, there are many disparate and disconnected deities, rituals, and doctrines. Daoism, like many textual traditions in the ancient world, grew up around centers of political and economic power. That is simply because few people were literate, and those who were usually wealthy and powerful and close to those centers of power, or they were centers of power themselves. As a result, the political nature of Daoism can't be ignored because that was the immediate environment and circumstance in which the Daodejing and other subsequent texts were written and compiled. When studying religions, especially in history, it quickly becomes clear that there are not incredibly strict boundaries between politics, religion, philosophy, and science, when it specifically comes to how people understand and apply the doctrines and the contents of that religion itself. There is undoubtedly much more to Daoism than just the political, but the political aspect is a huge portion, as we will see later in the discussion. Before that, however, we should lay out the understanding of the world and how it works, as it's laid out in Daoism. Many different Daoist texts have different creation stories and cosmogonies, but some of the common themes from them are that in the immeasurable past, there was undifferentiated chaos and darkness, and from that chaos differentiated two complementary forces, known as yin and yang. Yin represented all that was dark, soft, weak, receptive, passive, and female, and yang represented all that was light, firm, strong, active, and male. Importantly, these forces do not oppose each other. Instead, they complement each other and rely on each other for their differentiation, and for that of all things in the world. Dark is only meaningful relative to light, soft is only meaningful relative to hard, active is only meaningful relative to passive, etc. Yin and yang are commonly misunderstood in the West because of this problematic and mystical view of ancient Chinese religions. People commonly think that all Chinese people care about or even know about yin and yang, and they're concerned with balance in the world, balance in their lives, balance inside and outside, and so on. First, this is not something most Chinese people think about on a day-to-day basis. Second, trying to understand yin and yang in terms of a balanced universe where opposing forces are held in delicate balance is incorrect. It is entertaining for a television show or a book, but it's not accurate to the texts themselves. This is an instance where the difference comes from understanding these concepts as being prescriptive or descriptive. If we understand them as prescriptive, then it becomes easy to personify them and apply all sorts of mystical characteristics to them. This sort of thinking leads to incorrect interpretations of what these ideas refer to. Thinking of them as descriptive ideas is much more accurate. People describe and categorize the world around them according to these descriptive characteristics of being active or passive, light or dark, etc. We have this idea in the study of religion called the prime mover. This is the ultimate agent in a religious context. In Christianity, the prime mover is God. In Daoism, it is not yin and yang. Instead, it's the Tao, which is not conscious or sentient. The Christian God is, but not the Tao and not yin or yang. Moving along in our creation story, these two forces of yin and yang are further differentiated into the wuxing, or the 5 elements. These elements are water, fire, metal, earth, and wood. You'll find that, interestingly, metal and earth are separate elements, and there is no element for air. This is a rather different diagnosis of the component elements of reality than other Asian religions that we've encountered before. Instead of air, Daoism has an element of voidness or empty space, but that is not one of the constituent elements of the world. These 5 elements exist in a codependent relationship with each other. Wood feeds fire, fire produces earth in the form of ash and dust, metal collects water in the form of condensation, water nourishes wood, and so on. Each of these generative relationships is also weakening in the other direction. Fire consumes or depletes wood, earth depletes fire, and so on. These 5 also exist in regulatory relationships. Wood regulates earth, as roots of trees hold dirt in place. Earth contains and directs water in the form of rivers and dams. Water puts out fire. Fire melts and shapes metal, and metal cuts and carves wood. On the other hand, of course, these 5 exist in counteractive relationships as well. Wood dulls metal. Metal dulls fire by conducting heat away from it. Water erodes and destabilizes earth. Earth rots wood. Each of these elements, and the forces of yin and yang, exist in these balances and relationships at every scale. The entire universe represents a balanced interaction between these elements, and also, each human body represents a balance among them as well. Later in Daoism's history, it is argued that people's personalities express the natures of these 5 elements in various balances. For example, stubborn people represent the earth element. Dynamic and temperamental people represent fire. Flexible and easygoing people represent water, and so on. When these elements fall out of balance in the individual because of diet, external climate, or some kind of spiritual upset, various illnesses can arise, and there are medicinal prescriptions for how to repair the balance. For example, eating food that overrepresents the element of fire, such as cooked meat, depletes the wood element in the body, in the form of vegetables, and it melts the metal, or the minerals in your blood, and thus produces ash. The remedy for this is to drink water to quell the fire, eat vegetables to replenish the lost wood element, and eat foods high in minerals to replace the metal element. This is a straightforward example that is representative of a balanced diet, but this system is ultimately the foundation of what is collectively called traditional Chinese medicine, which is a very complex and diverse range of prescriptions and treatments for various ailments, all centered around the idea of elemental balance within the individual. That's a huge tangent we will discuss in more detail in another episode, but it should help you understand the nature of the wuxing philosophy. Back to the Tao. These 5 elements undergo a process that can be understood as self-organization, or spontaneous emergence, and this is known in Chinese as ziran. This is how we can explain the emergence of life in this cosmology. There is a spontaneous, non-sentient, and universal force that leads to what we would call, in modern science, the decrease of entropy. Simply put, it is the force that drives elements to organize themselves in such a way as to perpetuate the emergence of life, the continuation of the environment, and the cycling of the elements through unending change. This Jiran is also regarded as the default and primordial state of all things, to which we all must return if we intend to align our existence with the Tao. Aligning ourselves with this Tao, becoming like a mirror to the universe and to nature, unhindered by notions and concepts about the world, is the central goal of religious Taoism, and a great deal of the Daodejing discusses how this is undertaken. We will talk more about the contents of the Daodejing and how it argues that we can achieve this central goal in a moment. It is taught that once this occurs, once you achieve oneness with the Tao, you become a sage immortal. Through ascetic practices, meditative practices, and study of the Tao, you are said to gain supernatural powers, such as levitation, flying around, and immortality, and you go on to become a teacher of the Tao yourself. Another characteristic of the Tao that we ought to strive to cultivate in ourselves, according to Taoism, is De, the same De from the title of the Daodejing. This De translates to virtue, the argument being that the Tao is inherently virtuous, and that to align yourself with the Tao and become like a mirror to it is a virtuous act. If we do this, then that is the way to live a virtuous life. Now, when we ask ourselves, when we have achieved mirrorhood with regards to the Tao and its virtue, what are we actually doing? What are the ethical and moral principles by which we adhere? The answer is extremely complicated due to the fact that the unfolding of the Tao and the nature of it are all regarded as being totally ineffable. It is said time and time again in the texts that the Tao that can be spoken of is not the true Tao, because the Tao precludes learned behaviors and notions, such as language. We may ask ourselves, what about how animals kill each other in nature all the time? In aligning ourselves with the Tao, are we allowing ourselves to be like that? The answer to that is also complicated. On the one hand, we can see in Taoism one of the earliest imaginations and realizations of this thing we call nature. This is an environment that is untouched by humans and lacks any human interference and influence, and it's a place where the Tao unfolds unhindered. This is regarded as separate from a town or a city where people have knocked down trees to build buildings and roads and so on. Killing still happens in this idealized natural world, but in such a case, it's only part of the maintenance of the balance of the Tao. Death and destruction are necessary and inherent parts of the cycles of the elements in nature, and to deny that part of it ignores a crucial component. However, on the other hand, to kill out of malice or hatred and anger throws things out of balance. Killing, death, and such things are complicated in Taoism because of the influence of Buddhism. Abstinence from killing or harming living things unnecessarily is an important teaching in Taoism, but it's not clear how much of that is a result of the influence of Buddhism, which entered China in the 1st century or so. That covers most of the core components of Taoism. Now we can shift towards the contents of the Daodejing. The title of the work has 3 parts. The Tao refers to the way that we've been talking about. The De part refers to the characteristic of virtue that we mentioned. And finally, the Jing part translates to classic or work of. For instance, this is how all classics of Chinese literature and how all sutras are referred to in Chinese. The Avalokiteshvara Sutra is called the Guanyin Jing. The Classic of Changes is called the I Ching. So, the whole title can be translated in a couple of different ways. It could be the Classic of the Way and its Virtue, which is a pretty good title that captures how the text explicates the nature and the virtues of the Tao. However, the title could also go without the possessive and just say the Classic of the Way and of Virtue, which would again present that the text discusses both the Tao and virtue. Either translation is good in my opinion. The text is organized into 2 parts, the Daojing, chapters 1 through 37, and the Te-tao, chapters 38 through 81. As we have mentioned, it is a collection of passages written in classical Chinese about various topics, all under the purview of understanding the Tao. There are philosophical passages, military passages, religious and ritual passages, political passages, and more. The text argues that the Tao is unspeakable, primordial, and that the most natural state that one could exist in is the state of the Tao. It also argues that the way to return to that original state is to be like a baby. Babies are said to be born unencumbered by learned behaviors, notions, and misconceptions that upset the balance and the unfolding of the Tao. Babies are very strong, but still very soft. Their minds are clear and sharp, but they're still malleable and flexible. They rely on basic animalian instinct for the most part, but they also still very much inherently understand compassion and kindness. Their behaviors are understood to be perfect reflections of the Tao exactly as it is, and we need to unlearn everything and return to that state in order to realize the Tao in our own lives. You can see that this meshes quite nicely with original enlightenment in Buddhism. Similarly, we are called upon to be like water. Water is also very soft, pliable, and life-giving, but it still has the power to cut entire canyons out of the earth. This exposition of water also relates to another very important set of doctrines that are introduced in the Daodejing. There are two concepts that come up a great deal in the text relating to how the Tao moves forward, how we ought to understand it, and how we ought to realize harmony with it in our daily lives. The first one I would like to mention is Wu Wei. This word has two parts. The Wu part, which translates to non or not or without, such as in the Wu Men Guan, the gateless gate, and then also Wei, which translates to action, deliberateness, or intentional doing. The whole term can be translated to mean non-action, but that's not a complete translation, because the concept does not refer to doing nothing. That is, the Daodejing encourages cultivation of the virtue of Wu Wei, or non-action, but it does not argue that that is a state where you just sit around all day doing nothing. It might be better understood as meaning effortless action, or even effortless effort. This refers to an ideal state in which you carry out your daily life free from struggle against resistance, either physically, mentally, or emotionally. This is best understood in the context of martial arts. It's argued that martial arts reaches its highest potential when, instead of worrying about cultivating huge muscles and great physical strength, you cultivate effectiveness in your motions, be they punching or kicking or throwing, outside of the physical. The idea is that a punch thrown with a strong mind is more powerful than a punch thrown with a strong arm. This idea that physical strength is key to martial effectiveness is regarded as being a delusion that we learn and thus must unlearn in order to realize oneness with the Tao. That explains how you can see people break boards and concrete blocks and much larger objects even than that. If they were to try to make use of extreme physical strength to break a board or a block, they would injure themselves. If they were to think, I intend to break the block, they would injure themselves. However, if they act according to the principle of Wu Wei, then in their minds, the board or the block is already broken, and as a result, their physical motion of throwing a punch or a kick to break the thing is not an expression of a desire which is contradictory to the reality of things, where their desire is a broken board and the reality is a solid board. Instead, it is an expression of the reality of the board already being broken. If the board or the block is already broken, then the act of swinging their arms or swinging their legs to break it is effortless. On a separate but related note, this Wu Wei also has political applications. A politician or a ruler who has perfected Wu Wei is able to administer without having to tell people to do stuff, without having to enforce laws or to even do anything themselves, and without having to work or expend any effort. If they have cultivated complete and total virtue, then the people around them are naturally influenced by that virtue, and as a result, the virtue trickles down to every single level of society. It starts at the top of society with the ruler, and every ruler below is turned virtuous as a result. And when the rulers are virtuous, then the people are going to be virtuous because they're taken care of, and everybody treats everybody compassionately. This is the ideal, even though it's obvious that none of this has ever happened in real life. The next thing I wanted to mention is Wu Zhi. The character zhi in this word translates to knowledge, knowing, or understanding. Thus, this concept can be translated as non-knowing. Again, this is not a state of ignorance or stupidity. It is instead a state of continuous unknowing, like we've discussed in Buddhism. In the Daodejing, it is considered unethical to be the type of person who thinks they know everything all the time. Instead, it is encouraged for people to cultivate a continuously fresh mind that isn't encumbered by what they think they know about the world. The Tao is totally ineffable and mysterious and subtle, and so it is better to cultivate a state of receptiveness to the world around you than to cultivate a state of mind where you impose your so-called knowledge onto it. Our so-called knowledge about the world could be contextual, or it could be partially true and partially untrue, and so We might misunderstand it to be true all the time or to be completely true, but that might not actually be the case. One could also apply this to martial arts as we did before. If somebody looks at a concrete block and they say, "A human hand is weaker than a concrete block," or "hitting this really hard will injure me," that is all contextually or partially true knowledge, but in understanding the limits of the context, one can adapt to the new context of technique and mindset that's necessary to break the block with their hands. This is how the Daodejing argues that all learners and royal subjects ought to be in society. Conflict typically arises when one or both parties in an interaction are firm and unmoving in their mindset and knowledge and refuse to budge to accommodate the other. Thus, wucher is a virtue to cultivate in order to prevent social conflicts at all levels of society. This is again regarded as something that upright politicians and rulers ought to do as well. Instead of deciding that they know all there is to know and act on what they know, they ought to understand the boundaries and limits of their knowledge and seek to learn and expand their boundaries rather than hold fast to them. This is a state of non-rigidity in one's thinking that leads to adaptability, open-mindedness, being accepting, and being inclusive at every level of society. Once again, this is the ideal, but it rarely, if ever, has worked out this way in history. We have just finished discussing the basic characteristics and concepts of Daoism, and next time we'll pick up with political, philosophical, and religious Daoism, as well as Chinese traditional medicine. As we've already discussed, the Daoists are one political faction in history, while another one is the Confucians. So in the next episode of this mini-series on Daoism, we'll discuss Chinese traditional medicine in a little more depth, and we'll mention the points of opposition between Confucianism and Daoism in the political context. We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of Hearer.
And I'm Dox, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.